pleasure to read national thought in Europe, cultural history, and I read it with great sympathy. So first of all, I just want to thank for writing the book and letting me read it, and thank ASEN for inviting me to do this and have an opportunity. The paradox of these kinds of events is if you really dislike something, you probably decline the invitation. So one's always forced to try and find a debate without making an artificial debate, right? And so sometimes that means, not so much fiercely disagreeing with somebody, but finding different angles and bringing that out in the discussion. So we'll see whether we end up a brawl or not, but at least it should be interesting. I'm going to start by saying a few things about just about my kind of remit and talking about the book, and then I'll go on and talk about two main lines of querying I want to put on the table. I was asked to look particularly at the concept of ethnotypes. Benedikte has given us a kind of overview of the book, but this particular concept of ethnotypes that runs throughout the book is very central to its argument. So I think it's worth kind of stating at the outset how that gets defined. So I'm actually quoting here. There's a proposal to locate nationalism, quote, in a tradition of ethnotypes, that is, commonplaces and stereotypes of how we identify, view, and characterize others as opposed to ourselves. In tracing the development of national thought and nationalism, it's important to follow alongside the socio-political nation-building developments that take place in and between societies, also the discursive patterns of self-identification, exoticization, and characterization that take place in the field of culture. So there's this concern with this, how this kind of ideological discursive system, taxonomies of ethnotypes, of categorizing other national peoples and themselves, evolves as a kind of body of knowledge in Europe. The book moves through kind of four major parts. First, talking about source traditions, kind of root sources, various kinds of discursive formations that go further back into medieval European history that seem to lay some of the groundwork for this system of national ethnotypes that is the core concern of the book later on. And then there's an emphasis on a kind of crystallization of some of these ideas of national types from about 1800 on, under the pressures of Napoleonic conquest and responses to that, and the formation of more modern forms of the state in the 19th century, centralized territorial state. This leads to a third section that really focuses on the extreme elaboration of these ethnotypes in Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then finally, the last section of the book talks about reflections on the possible threats and hazards and dangers of continuing reviving forms of ethnotypes in Europe and possible futures and implications of that for nationalism as we move on. So I want to suggest, just we'll lay out that that's the kind of the arc of the book in terms of what it's trying to say. And it's just chock full of wonderful little bits and byways. One of my favorites was a kind of series of pages that's reflecting on early modern drama and the use of national characters as a kind of necessary dramatic tool for setting up certain kinds of stock figures in early modern European drama. That's something I hadn't really thought about as one of the various streams that kind of feed into the kind of macro formation of this stuff. So that's just one bit that I particularly enjoy. It's full of many other things like that give you this kind of complex picture of the process we're doing. Now, on to some of my queries. Having confessed that I really enjoyed it. They fall under two categories. One is kind of creating the Europeanness, or how purely European the process of ethnotyping that we're describing is. And then a second set of questions about the general kind of model of historical process that one that is sort of always in the background is kind of a master narrative. That was part of my point in sort of sketching the art of the book to comment on. So to talk about the first point, my query is the ideological process in question really bounded by Europe? One of the source traditions that Professor Leerssen points to is the dichotomy between the notion of the wild and the civilized that goes well back into control of. Where I'm from, up in Scotland, there's of course a long history of the representation of Highlanders by Lowlanders in a similar way that involves a kind of not ethnotyping in the modern national sense, but there's this other that is particularly from the hinterland, from the more rural parts, less urban, less and organized socially in different ways. That provides at least a template for thinking about others. One of my points about this is I'm inclined to suspect that there are connections between that and it's kind of getting replayed again in another form in the age of imperial conquest of the Americas and other parts of the globe. That just as it functions as a kind of early source tradition or early version of othering symbolically, social categorizing, that later feeds into this system of taxonomy of European ethnotypes. And at the same time, that process carries on a second life in the expansion of European populations around the globe as they encounter Native Americans, indigenous populations in Africa and around the world, and go through some similar processes of othering and perceiving the sort of savage others out there as wild and needing to retain the law and control of these European settlers and colonists that are spreading around the world. So I have a question about, isn't there a possibility that there are kind of continuities going on between both those processes? By the same token, I also have a kind of gut suspicion, I had the time to really chase down the basis of it, but that similarly, later in the kind of romantic period when you get the full flowering of the sort of romantic representation of the peasantry, of the Volk as authentic, pure, virtuous, representing the essence of the national group that somehow needs to be recovered under modern conditions. That there are also continuities between that maneuver, not treating the other as a dangerous, savage, wild thing, but as an attractive, untainted, early form of oneself. That also goes on in this wider world context of European exploration and conquest and encounters with Native Americans who are seen as representatives of the classic Rousseauian term noble savage, as possible candidates, better candidates for Christianity than degraded populations back in Europe, precisely because they are more pure. I fully accept the argument that there is a very distinctive and somewhat bounded process of ethnotyping in terms of nationalism going on in Europe. But I think there are perhaps further questions to be asked about how that is articulated with other ideological processes of symbolic othering of other peoples that are going on at the same time in a wider frame. Part of the crux of what I'm saying here is simply the question, is Europe the true partner of nationalism? It may sound like an ugly American here, but it's not all yours, it's ours as well. I'm inclined to argue that modern nationalism took shape as a transatlantic process, a field of novel ideas that was centered on the 18th century and particularly the universe of imperial conquest by Britain and France and to a lesser degree Spain across the Atlantic. That really is in some sense focused on or summed up in the key revolutions of 1776 when the American colonies broke away and 1789 the French Revolution when the French system collapsed. My point here is that simply, in my opinion, if you have to stick a pin in the globe and say, where's the center of the literal geographic space of nationalism that took shape, it's right in the middle of the Atlantic. And it's actually happening on the western seaboard of Europe, especially, and the eastern seaboard of the Americas. That's where the universe of people who are talking, exchanging ideas, and forming some of these ideas is centered. That's my view. You don't have to accept it, but that forces me to see things differently, if I stick to my guns. Okay, so that's kind of about he treats very much the period of Napoleonic conquest after the French Revolution and resistance to that, and response to it, and resistance, and kind of, it's like the classic kind of German rejection of kind of French cultural hegemony. At the same time, with the modern territorial state, the more centralized state is forming in the 19th century. This is kind of the crucible in which these various bits and bobs that were, source traditions that were feeding into and providing a kind of incipient raw material for ethnotypes really sort of gels and crystallizes into the thing that he's talking about. These kind of processes. As I just suggested, I see this sort of transatlantic context of imperial competition and collapse and secession as more the universe of key events that took place across the 18th century. For me, politics, and I use this term advisedly because for me politics is not simply merely political institutions and government. It's the principles by which social power gets organized in many different ways throughout society, not just government. And it gets culturally organized as well as institutional. Is crucial to social and historical explanation. For me, the 18th century sees a shift from a politics based on personalism, patronage, clientelism, fealty, to politics based on a vast, complex patronage network up to the monarch, to one based on the idea of a self-governing demos, a people bounded by a social contract. Understandings of authority, legitimacy, which are once both political and cultural, as I just said, were fundamentally transformed in this process that those two revolutions were so crucial for. And this posed a new and permanent political and cultural problem. Who are the people? Who are these people? In my view, the crystallization of ethnotypes that Joep was talking about in the 19th century was triggered by the previous 18th century shift in power and how it's imagined and organized. And I grant that there were more proximate causes, such as Napoleon, the fluorescence of the science of philology, and various other things that are more immediately helping to take shape. But one must rank causes in order to explain events. And for me, the big event happened in the 18th century. The posing of the problem of who is the demos, who are these people, is something that calls forth the need to explain these ethnotypes more fully. So, my answer is that these ethnotypes are an answer to this question: who are the people? And I would say that this answer, the ethnotypical answer, has coexisted and competed with more abstract, civic, recently multicultural answers to the same question: who are the people? There are allusions to Habermas's constitutional patriotism towards the end of the book, and that's yet another attempt to answer. So I'm not. These two things are locked in a twin death struggle, and they never seem to get out of it. But the one is the question, and the other is one of the answers. So to sum up, I argue that the universe of ideas in which ethnotypes operate was wider than Europe, at least in the geographic sense. That the transformations of authority and legitimacy in the 18th century were crucial for the subsequent career of these ethnotypes. And thank you again for provoking me to have these thoughts on this relating editorial work.
We also need this thing, if I can. Because I've got a cold, so my voice is not the strongest today. Well, thanks also for being given the opportunity to talk about this. Let me say straight away that this is an excellent book, and I won't be able to do justice to it here, but I will try to express a few comments. Now, my critical comments should be seen in the spirit of, I think, in a positive spirit, because I think mutual backscratching is something that academics do too often, and we didn't know each other before, so there's no danger of that happening now. Because I think if we criticize each other, actually, it's a sign that we take each other seriously. If we just praise, it's a sign that we don't take each other very seriously. That's how I look at it. But I'll first say a few things where I think the real strength of this book lie for me, and then turn to a couple of critical remarks. I don't know whether you have read the book. Obviously, it's always good if even if we have a debate, if you know that someone who writes what is, I mean, if you're a historian of the 19th century and you've read on cultural nationalism, romanticism, this is kind of a synthesis, but what it is a bold synthesis that actually constructs an argument. I'm not saying, obviously, that Joep hasn't looked at original text and so on, he has done that, but it's still, it's not a completely fresh kind of account, but he dares to actually construct an argument out of something, or out of things that are actually familiar. That to me is a great strength. Then, of course, Benedikte has already said that. Another strength is that Joep really takes culture seriously. I mean, this is a book doesn't make any kind of bones about that. He mentioned you, John Hutchinson, and says, well, it's a wonderful book by John Hutchinson, but then he goes back to this kind of sociological kind of, he reduces it back and talks about social movements and so on. Culture is the thing. So here's someone who really turns on culture 100%. Then, more specifically, strengths that I think this book shows is, first of all, really this emphasis on cultural nationalism as a transnational movement. Again, this is something that he consistently stresses. It's not just something that you don't hear the fancy term transnationalism in the introduction, then he loses it again. No, this is actually something that he focuses on consistently. I just quote from a paper that he has published, which was published, I think, in Nations and Nationalism, which contains this kind of argument, where he argues that cultural nationalism is an international movement, not just a cultural fallout of separate political nationalist movements. It is an international, it is as international movement or intellectual fashion as romanticism, with ideas and initiatives from one country picked up, imitated or applied elsewhere in a swirl of cross-border intellectual traffic. So this is the kind of framework that he applies. Then another strength, I think, of the book, and I think that is slightly less, for me at least, is then slightly less demonstrated, but it's a powerful thought, which is that Joep emphasizes that early nationalist thinkers simultaneously operated on a number of institutional levels. So he wants to move away from this idea that they were simply intellectuals, intellectuals and nothing else. And again, I quote page 185 of the book, where he says, 19th century philologists stood with one leg in the field of literature and learning, with another in the arena of politics and its emerging institutions. They were in large measure the go-betweens, the transmitting agents from one sphere to the other. So this is this powerful thought. As I said, I think this, I would have liked to actually see more of this in the book then. I mean, it's obviously that's difficult, and that's kind of, you could devote your entire life to kind of teasing out these connections, but I would like to see a little bit more of that. Now I'll turn to my critical comments. And I don't here really focus on the fine print of the book. We don't have time for that. Also, I think a book of this kind, which makes sometimes explicitly, certainly implicitly, which advances a big argument, should also be looked at in this way. So for me, one of the critical, the problematic areas is the treatment of culture. For me, this is a strength. On the one hand, as I've said, it's a strength. Joep takes culture seriously. But nationalist thought becomes, in this book, nationalist culture. I don't know how many of you know the debate between Vidar Skocpol and William Sewell. It's a very famous exchange between these two great scholars over the use of the term ideology. And Skocpol, the context is the explanation of revolutions. I mean, my students need to read this exchange. It's one of the most important things. So if you study nationalism, I think you should read this because conceptually it's so illuminating. Where Skocpol accuses Sewell of treating culture treating ideology as a cultural system. So ideology is kind of widely diffused across society. And yes, this kind of anthropological use of culture. And I think that is indeed a problem, this idea that we have got these thinkers and they cultivate the culture, and that is then sort of the culture structure of society. So it's a tendency to treat culture, to move from thinkers to culture, and then treat culture as kind of structural, having structural properties. To over-exaggerate that point slightly, one could say that cultural nationalism in this book becomes the independent variable. That's over-exaggerating, but I want to get the thrift of my point. So then also, I wonder also whether there is not a tendency in this kind of thinking about cultural nationalism that we treat, for example, ordinary people as simply being impregnated with the narratives of Grimm and Arndt, for example, to refer to Germans, in a kind of top-down manner. They become infused with this kind of argument. Now, I, as someone who is also interested in social history and tries to connect social history with nationalism, I very much think that ordinary people itself a problematic concept, of people that sort of, not just the middle classes who join the choral societies, for example, they could also be creative agents in this nationalist kind of, in this nationalist 19th century. Because I think it's one of the big, there's one of the big acts of self-denial that a certain group of scholars talk about nationalism as if this was something which had been invented by elites, spread by elites, and absorbed by sort of the rest of society. Whereas I think of it much more as a dance with many participants. You know, people were involved in it. We would all have been involved in it at some point. We would have had to engage with it. And the question is, what do you do with it? So that's my first criticism, to kind of the treatment of culture as concept. My second sort of critical remark concerns this idea that the 19th century saw a large-scale shift from patriotism to nationalism, from the more democratic, universalist types of national narratives to the more reactionary and right-wing kind of narrative. I'm quite familiar with that narrative from German history. This is something that German historians have been arguing for a long time. I'm not so sure. I think nationalism throughout the 19th century was actually a competitive project. You did have very different nationalisms competing with each other. So the idea that you shift from a sort of let's call it a left wing or a more open-minded patriotism to a right-wing nationalism, I think that was not quite the case. In Germany, for example, in the later 19th century, second half of the 19th century, you still do find clashes in the 1880s, for example, between what I would call more liberal, progressive kind of nationalists and the right-wing nationalists. So I think throughout the 19th century there is a competition. So this concerns this idea of a large-scale shift. I think there was a great deal of contestation and competition within nationalism itself. I mean, you know, socialists were involved in nationalist argument, for example. Then, and this is related to the second point, and again, I mean, I don't mean this as a kind of destructive comment. Again, I mean it as something I want to put to you, because I take the book seriously, is that overall I get the impression when I kind of move towards the end of this book, where he also has a couple of chapters that are read like outlooks, looking forward and, you know, what comes next. I think I get the impression that there is a negative teleology that is kind of running through the book. Particularly when you look at interwar nationalism, the discussion is a very short chapter on interwar nationalism, and there you turns on Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles and talks about national self-determination, and this becomes the problematic thing, because he argues that the Treaty of Versailles and particularly Wilson's ideas were informed by this purist ethnic nationalism of the 19th century. Now that may well be true, but as far as I'm concerned, interwar nationalism, of course, interwar, there is no division between us as far as interwar nationalism is concerned. There were some very negative things happening. Of course, the successor states, we're looking at really the winner takes it all. That was the problem. So what I'm saying here is, the problem was not the principle of national self-determination. I've argued that in my own little book, which exists now in a Japanese translation. Joep exists in the Chinese translation. I've argued that the problem is not Wilson and it's not the Treaty of Versailles. So I was just mentioning that because it may be very bad if they read that kind of thing. But the problem is not national self-determination, because it could have been better if, for example, let's say the newly created Poland, the newly created Czechoslovakia, if national self-determination had been interpreted as giving, for example, cultural autonomy, because let's remember in the 19th century, not every nationalism was aiming for self-determination, political self-determination in terms of independent state. But the problem was, of course, that in newly created Poland and newly created Czechoslovakia, the mentality was that the dominant culture should actually rule, and the dominant culture should dominate the schools, etc., etc. So for me, the problem is not national self-determination as such, although that's a problematic concept, of course. But the problem is how the larger groups were actually given a carte blanche to actually bully the minorities into submission. So I think, I'm just mentioning this because I think this is the sort of, for me, this is the national teleology. We get the interwar sort of period, we get these kinds of nationalists, and then sort of the implicit assumption seems to be that this is where nationalism necessarily leads. Okay, now I sort of conclude on Habermas, because you've also mentioned this Habermas, the idea of Verfassungs patriotismus. I'm quite skeptical of this concept, because to me a purely voluntarist community, and that's what it would be, a constitution, a voluntarist kind of act, a voluntarist endorsement of a constitution, does not, a community that is just voluntarist, a positive attitude to the constitution, without the resort to historicism, to me, is not realistic. And this is not about shared ethnicity. So what I have been arguing in my longer version, which you got to read, is that the construction of a community always involves a historicist element, or is likely to involve a historicist element. So my solution to the problem, and this is my final thought, my solution to the problem, or my suggestion, because I don't have a solution, my suggestion is that we should aim for what I call an ironic historicism. Historicism, we know, I've seen people who I would call as ironic historicists. They've argued, for example, in Switzerland, where I'm from Zurich, I've lived in this country for a long time, but where people are smiling when they talk about William Tell, and they smile when they talk about medieval ages. They know the narratives that relate to medieval ages, and also find them quite charming, and also think that they are actually quite useful, but they are smiling about them and they don't take them totally seriously. And that is, of course, was different in the 19th century. In the 19th century, I believe that was a very difficult position to adopt. All those people did adopt. So I would sort of plead for an ironic historicism, because I think that would be a nice complement to Verfassungs patriotism. So we have, on the one hand, the voluntarist conception of nation, and on the other hand, people can also kind of laugh about their own historical narratives. That's all I have to say.
Right, thank you very much. I'm in a very privileged position to have had such generous and intelligent readers respond, and there's a whole lot to respond to, and I wonder how much I can cover within 20 minutes. I'll try and say a few things generally on what the book was trying to do, and then in the course of that I hope also to address some of the very interesting issues raised by Jonathan and Oliver. Because I mean, this book took a while being written, and I'm now rereading it with fresh eyes and reflecting in the judgment of others, so I get a different purchase. I do indeed start from ethnotypes, which might sound like an uncouth neologism and a sort of ad hoc concocted concept in these circles, but coming as I do from comparative literature, where we have a specialist themselves and others, and how this adds up to an intertextual, literally commonplace. It's something we work with. It's a working concept, and I thought it would be interesting to apply it to nationalism studies, because there's a big bifurcation in nationalism studies. Both John Royley and Anthony Smith both say as their first point in was nationalism that it's predicated on the idea that there exists something like separate nations, each with a specific character. And that's where the comparison simply says, aha, character of nations, we know where that comes from. How can we construct that? And the interesting thing about ethnotypes is that they are very, very long-standing in intellectual history. And at the same time, they're extremely volatile. That's to say, they can be positively or negatively valorized. They change whether they are spoken in the first person, as an auto-image, or in the third person, as the exoticism or denigration of others. But we have mechanisms of studying that, and we've been doing that for 50 years, and we have a certain expertise with that. And the interesting thing is that ethnotypes take place not within the bosom of the ethnicity, not within the nation, but on the skin. They take place where the nation meets its non-members, where it meets its others, where differences are registered. And since I think nationalism has to learn from a comparative history, and if, following Anne-Marie Thiers, nationalism is, of all things, a very international, rien de plus international que le nationalisme, she puts it. It would be interesting also to see what happens in the development of nationalism in the interstices between nations, on the skin of nations where they touch each other. And given the mobility of ethnotypes and the cultural ambience within which they're formulated and disseminated, I thought it might be an interesting angle or thread in Ariadne's labyrinth in following all this. In looking at nationalism as the political instrumentalization of ethnotypes, how do notions of national characters, of national specificity, harden into political doctrines? Indeed, I was looking at almost a universal thing which at some points leads to specific manifestations in Europe. I'm not a Eurocentrist, but I'm looking at things that go differently in Europe than in the rest of the world. The intertextual tradition within which the notion of national characters takes place in Europe is held together by the very, very long intertextual currency of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as related by Cicero and Justinian's law system, and by Tacitus and certain notions on the state, the individual, civilization, and rustic life. Indeed, it is in neoclassical thought in the 17th century that, specifically in theatre, the ideas of Spaniards are like this and French are like that hardens into a system. It's sort of a Foucault notion that the 17th century becomes systematic. And it's interesting to realize that the phrase l'opinion du public, public opinion, is first used by French playwrights when they describe audience reactions to theatre pieces. And it's very Habermasian to think that in the theatre something like a public opinion shape, but that is to some extent a literary process. There is then a specific, classically rooted intertextuality that binds Europe together as a space with sort of internal textual coherence. And then something happens around 1800. Now, this is one of the dualities which I want to explore in my response, because like every duality, it is problematic. Something happens around 1800. It's not only the impact of the democratic revolutions of the Atlantic experience, it's also a paradigm break in European intellectual history. A new linguistic system is worked out which no longer looks to Hebrew, the matrix language of all languages, which begins to look to Sanskrit. The habit of historicism is developed by philologists and by historians alike. The idea that everything that exists as the outcome as a growth process and should be studied as such. And this links the constitutional thought of Savigny, the philological thought of Grimm, and the historical thought of Ranke, and Michelet and all the others. And there is a new romantic idealism which believes that practical life is informed by ideas, and that certain sensibilities like poetic inspiration have a particular antenna to capture the Zeitgeist or the Volksgeist or all these transcendent quiddities which are almost metaphysical and which are then seen as a particular way of sort of metaphysically informing physics. These things take place in Europe and hardly outside Europe. Romanticism is a European movement. There's very little to be seen parallel across the water. There's a certain effect in Longfellow, and you can see certain parallels. But together with institutional changes like the setting up of state archives, universities, libraries, and the new position of intellectuals in public life, I think here perhaps Europe becomes, can I say, exceptional, that we have a European exceptionalism to global trends, that there might be a global notion of self-rule that goes straight back to George Washington and Simon Bolivar in South America, and which winds its global course, that something separate happens within Europe, which I call romanticism. And historical novels are written in the Bengal Renaissance at the end of the 19th century. I do not want to sort of see complete hermetic barriers between Europe and the rest of the world, but it strikes me that communication within Europe is a hell of a lot denser and more intensive than communication between Europe and the rest of the world in this type of discourse, and that there's a sensible shift. And that this also separates the traditions of 18th century patriotism, Enlightenment patriotism, from romantic nationalism. In that romantic nationalism starts from a transcendent idea of national identity, and adds to the nation as a social contract, a synchronic definition of the nation as a people that needs to be empowered in running the affairs of state, which I would say is indeed transatlantic. And sort of Palmer idea of democratic revolutions, why not? It's a perfectly valid model. Added to this notion of self-rule, there is a new conception of self, which is diachronic, which is historicist, which sees the nation as the transgenerational solidarity between ancestors and offspring, and which sees a permanence in the nation rooted precisely in culture. This historicist culture, this Fichtean idea, which adds a diachronic transgenerational component to the notion of self-rule, is again an addition, but it's an addition that I see happening in Europe more strongly than happening outside. And so I do think it's legitimate, very tentatively, to say that there is a certain distinction that we can follow between Europe and the rest of the world, and there is a certain distinction between what is set afoot in the 18th century as part of the rise of democratic thought and what happens within Europe. Does that also trigger what Oliver calls my negative teleology? I do study nationalism as a problem. I think that nationalism created as many problems as it solved, not more. And the idea that we all need a little bit of nationalism to have a viable state, and that we need ironic historicism. I think ironic historicism is even more problematic than verfassungsrelativism. Neither of them are particularly realistic propositions. I have seen in Holland that we've had national history museums which were mooted in the climate of a new anti-cosmopolitanism as it took shape in the last 10 years, and which began by being very postmodern and very, very ironic, and became more and more serious about themselves as it goes on. And usually irony is only one side of the coin. The irony of Das Army is the opposite end of the Thatcherite nationalism. I think the two go hand in hand. You can't, if irony is half joking, it's also half serious. So yes, there is a negative teleology in nationalism, and I think it shows over time. Nationalism has a number of unresolved internal contradictions, which are not that apparent before 1848, but become more and more stark as the 19th century wears on. Nationalism, for me, at least in the European subtype of nationalism that I study in particular, is which is very different from the type of anti-colonial nationalism as it is practiced in the 20th century elsewhere. Is predicated on a conflation between demos and ethos. We never know whether the nation is a social contract, a demos, or a cultural tradition, an ethos. And you might even say that nationalists are continuously conflating those two notions in what they say the nation is. By the same token, nationalism is also confusing culture as an intellectual ambience of what people do, how they shape their daily lives, with the geographical footprint that this takes place. We could define European nationalism as a territorialization of culture. It begins with Arndt asking, was ist das deutsche Vaterland? We all know what a German is, but where are the borders of Germany? Well, they're around Schleswig-Holstein, Alsace-Lorraine, and Sudetenland. So you realize notion of Italian irredentism, the legali idea in Greece, everywhere where the notion of a cultural tradition is translated into a territorial state, we have a massive problem. So the innate culturalism of European national traditions is problematic, and this is a problematic that only reveals itself in the course of the 19th century. And then I think also there is the idea in the bottom line definition, one nation per state, one state per nation, the hyphen in the word nation state, that this implies that the ideal state is monocultural, as a single nationality. That is a logic which we ought to query from the word go, and the exclusivism in many of the successor states of the emergent Versailles is, I think, due directly to this ingrained idea, which is not only a sort of ethnicism in Central Europe, but which already in 1792, when the République Française une et indivisible is pronounced, at the same time that all the dialects of France are declared illegal, you see that, you know, at the bosom of the democratic experiment is the origin of the modern dictatorship. And at the bosom of the emancipation of the nation is the idea of very aggressive. And incidentally, that type of ethnicization of citizenship is something that I do not see happen across the Atlantic, where things stay in a way saner than they are in Europe. Although it's a society based in slavery. So much for a few notions on setting off Europe from the rest of the world and looking at what happened and what was set in motion in the 19th century. Maybe the third and the final point that I want to address is the very vexed dualism between culture and politics, or culture and society. Both of you also address that. It struck me that from my background in comparative literature, and also from the extensive source work I've done on the development of Irish national self-images before 1800, and the instrumentalization of those self-images into Irish nationalism after 1800, that the discursive, consciousness-raising cultural things were datably earlier than the social actions that followed. I think Lewis Rapport had a point when he gave phase A the first letter in the alphabet. We see, certainly in non-European nationalism, that social activism comes first. But within Europe, very often it's the people who collect fairy tales, who write the dictionaries, who write the history books, who come first, and the social activists and political activists who follow in their footsteps. And I also thought that it was very important to see this sphere of cultural activity as something with agency, because too often, certainly in literary sociology, culture is seen as a mirror to society, which is a very inert, passive role, and it seemed to me to elide the very active role that cultural consciousness raising can have in social affairs. And I tried to look at the more active aspects of culture under the heading of the cultivation of culture, as something that you do, something that is performative. And at that moment, the distinction between culture and society, or culture and politics, largely disappears. I would argue that both cultural activities and social praxis require two elements, which is reflection. People think about what they're doing. It's never just dawned on, a tsunami hits the shore. It's something that is being rationalized as happening because the actors are humans. And secondly, it's communicated. Now, reflected, communicated culture is a form of social action. And reflected, communicated social praxis is a form of culture. At the levels of reflection and communication, the two shade into each other. And what I mean by this, maybe I can give an example. The ideas of Grimm and Fichte as they and what ordinary folk did on the ground in mid-19th century Germany. The case here would be that of choral societies. One enormously important form of cultural mobilization of a certain type of lower to middle classes in German urban life was the Männergesangverein, the male choir. You can actually, if you look at this not just as the outgrowth of a from Stuttgart or southern Germany, this is covered in choral societies, and from Berlin, all of the Prussian Rhine province is covered in choral societies. And everybody starts singing. And what do they sing? I mean, this is so far, it's a social story, this is a form of social mobilization. The repertoire is constantly patriotic and national. It's always "Ahnt was es das deutsche Vaterland." And it's the one thing that if you sing "Long Live Luther," you might be very popular with Catholic choir, but if you say "Long Live the Fatherland," it's a sort of quasi-unpolitical thing, that's unpolitisch, which everybody agrees to. And so these choral societies are as unquestionably national as the Middle Ages are unquestionably religious. Michael Billig talks about banal nationalism. This is basically the condition of cultural nationalism in the 19th century. Cultural nationalism is everywhere. All of cultural pursuits are suffused with national, patriotic, high-minded ideas, and because it's everywhere, it tends to get registered nowhere. If you look at these phenomena from a socio-historical point of view, you can see them in their rise, but in terms of the ideological punch that they pack, it might be more interesting to look at them from the other side, to look at the repertoire, to look at the national ideas, how they are diffused and how they get deep penetration. When in 1948 the Bundestag met for the first time after the war, they needed a stand-in national anthem. Nobody thought about it. Hofmanns Lied der Deutschen was not acceptable. And so somebody said, we'll take Maasmann, Ich hab mich ergeben, which incidentally in translation is now the national anthem of Micronesia, because the Bismarck Islands were German. But anyway. And everybody could sing this. Why? Because everybody had been a student and this was part of the student songbook. And so this had penetrated so deep as a doxa, as a habitus, that it was present immediately as activation. Like Hamid für das deutsche Vaterland, it was just there. Also, and this is where I'm going to finish now, basically it's a question of chicken and eggs. If you look at reflected communicated culture, and you look at reflected communicated social actions, which then meet in a certain middle ground, and you look at which is the agency, what's the cause and what's the effect. It's like chicken and eggs, but we're always habituated to seeing society as the chicken and culture as the eggs. And it would be nice sometimes to look and see how eggs produce other eggs through the intermediacy of chickens. It's sort of counterintuitive, but it should be equally valid. And my example here is the way the choral society spread to Estonia, which at the time had an urban middle-class German culture in Dorpat and Tartu and Reval and Tallinn, and sure enough, choral societies were founded there as well. These were taken over by serfs, recently liberated, totally unaware of what they should call themselves. The self-appellation Estonians only appears for the first time in the 1860s. And they have no print media or Benedikte style imagined sort of infrastructures worth speaking of, and instead they form embodied communities rather than imagined communities. They too start meeting in choral societies. And a repertoire is written for them by Lydia Koilula and others, and suddenly we get first hundreds and then thousands of Estonians singing patriotic Estonian songs. And twice over, this is the carrier wave which becomes the manifestation of an Estonian sense of a cultural identity and a claim to national independence. First at the end of the 19th century, and again at the collapse of the Soviet system, what is known in the Baltics as the Singing Revolution. If you see it nowadays, there's still loud obidos going on in Tallinn. It looks like something halfway between Woodstock and a Nuremberg party rally. The cultural formats are all German. The men are wearing uniforms from German Burschenschaft. Indeed, the flag of Estonia is an adopted flag of a German Burschenschaft. Things which are, conservative and certainly in the 20th century, a form of reactionary nationalism, people in traditional peasant dress, Trachtenverein, but instrumentalized in a wholly different way. So, there I think cultural transfer procedures, as I call it nowadays, the migrating power of ethnotypes and what's happening between nationalities, how through the incredible mobility ambience of the spread of ideas, the self-propagating power of culture, if we do not look at the very local social infrastructures, but at the communicative power of culture and the spread of these ideas, I think we get a more interesting perspective towards a comparative history of nationalism. I'm not sure if I addressed all the important issues that were raised here, and many of them I only addressed tangentially. I think I'll leave it this. Things might be picked up again. I'm not my reading glasses here. We might have another second class. Thank you.
Thank you very much for most of you. Before we wrap up and close the debate, I think we have time for a couple of questions. First of all, just to see if either has a reaction to the reply of the.
But just very briefly, just one, obviously there were many things, but one thing I would stress is that for me, historicism, I mean, when you talk about historicism, also when I said there's ironic historicism, I immediately thought of historicism equals shared ethnicity. And for me, that's not necessarily the case. I think historicism is about the construction of historic unity, and you know, in romanticism, for me also, that's why I also find the term romantic as an umbrella term, because I think romanticism may be a form, for example, reference to the peasant. Let's take that, I mean, we disagree on that. But the reference to the peasant, let's call that a romantic form. But the peasant may be in Michelet's hand. The peasant is a smallholding peasant, and he's politically active. And in a way, I think, so he's a very political peasant. And you can also have the peasant, and there's another would also fit this romantic form of historicism, whereas the peasant is just simply a symbol of the ethnically pure. And to me, we need to look at these things and these differences. I think that's important. That's my own.
If I can, I will give an anecdote first, and then just a brief comment. These are 5 remarks reminding me. I grew up in Central Texas, Austin. Central Texas was settled in the late 19th century by Germans, surrounded by towns like Braunfels and stuff. And just about every one of these towns has in the town square a building that's known as, talk German, Texan, Seinrüttige Hall, where the settlers, and the people of the area would get together and sing German songs and drink beer. So, I want to acknowledge the incredible spread and ability to travel. So some of the things you're talking about. Now we play country music in those places, but it just struck me. The main comment I would just say, very kind of large and complex, is it seems to me that both of us are interested in this problem of the relationship between ethnos and demos. In that way, I put them in a death struggle, and we have a similar kind of way of talking about them. But it does seem to me that, rightly or wrongly, however you refer, the kind of difference between us is that you tend to identify nationalism with the ethnos side of that relationship, and I tend to define nationalism as the relationship itself. That's a fundamental difference in how we're using the term. In our arguments about what's the right way to use it. But I think that's something that's very basic. So I just want to say that.
Thanks very much. Maybe that last point first. I guess you're right. I tend to locate in my study the 19th century development of nationalism primarily in ethnic thought, and I fully accept that that is maybe Brincker than European, and that if you want to do it globally, you might want to think of demotic thought or demos thought more. Within Europe, I'd say the emphasis on the nation as a social stratum is also taken over by social democracy, by other ideologies besides nationalism. Oliver raises the notion of the peasant and views of the peasantry, and I'm very glad he does, because it also allows me to come back to an important thing that Jonathan raised, the extent to which ethnotypes, and certainly the tradition of European exoticism and the noble savage in the 18th century, continues across this watershed of 1800, and that indeed ethnotypes formed in the encounter with the non-European other might be operated within European discourse. And if Benedikte allows me, I'll take a minute or two to go into that, because it's a very important point. To begin with the tradition of ethnotyping, of course, that persists as a cultural habitus, also outside its immediate political instrumentalization, which I am. And so any proper history, intellectual history of Europe should place alongside the history of nationalism, the history of ethnic thought and racism. The two are not the same, they don't follow the same social or chronological pathways. They do influence each other increasingly from the end of the 19th century onwards. But the tradition of ethnotyping and racialist and racist thought in the 19th century remains incredibly important. And of course, denigrating and de-Europeanizing a group goes hand in hand. And that was very strong. It's at the basis of what we now call post-colonial studies. And it was already seen very clearly by Frantz Fanon, who said it's impossible to subject a nation without denigrating. And who also has this wonderful idea that it's the whites who come up with the notion of nigger. C'est le blanc qui crée le nègre. But the consciousness-raising movement of négritude is something that blacks create for themselves. C'est le blanc qui crée le nègre, mais c'est le nègre qui crée la négritude. All these dynamics exist and are very important. And I'd say certainly in othering and in the notion of hate propaganda, the stock in trade of Eurocentric racism is a rhetorical tool that is used in international affairs within Europe, and you can see its application. And thank you very much for drawing our attention to that. Whether the other side, the positive appreciation of simple people, Dorothy Noyes calls it subjunctive space, which I think is a very happy phrase, a form of exoticism where you imagine different lifestyles, which is the noble savage of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the North American Indian or Tahiti. Whether that is influential in the way the peasantry is viewed in romantic terms, I'm not so sure, because exoticism is predicated on otherness. These people are totally different from us. Whereas the appreciation of the rural folk and the peasantry is predicated on a very strong sense of this is us. This is what we were like before we were self-alienated by education. So certainly something changes there. But within this curious, and in the case of Ireland I've spoken of auto-exoticism, the idea of seeing yourself as an exotic lifestyle, and looking at the primitive roots of your own nation, the storytellers, the fairy tales, the traditions in the countryside, etc. That is a very strong romantic tradition in Europe. It's also very important in conceptualizing the national character. And I would put it to Oliver that I think it's almost generalized all over Europe, that people believe that the purest form of national identity subsists within the rural, rustic, lower strata of society. That is, the peasantry, that it has the best examples of the national values, and that what Grimm sees as the backbone of a German ethnicity, or what Michelet sees as the backbone of a French ethnicity. They all have their ideas of what Germany or France ought to be like, but they always locate it away from the urban elites into the unspoiled countryside. There's a massive idyllic notion of the countryside as an unspoiled reservoir of primeval role patterns and ethnicity, which is activated by folklore scholars, by historians, and from Thomas Hardy to Tolstoy.
All right. It's no easy task to sum up all the points that have been raised here, but I think perhaps trying to draw some lines, I would say we have some conceptual points, talking about, first of all, the importance of ethnotypes, but perhaps most importantly also in relation to Anthony Smith's work. What is the relationship between ethnotypes and ethnicity? We've also talked about the link between cultural, nationalism and social history. Oliver Zimmer has pressed that point quite a bit, saying that how do we avoid providing an account of cultural history which carries the risk of being considered elitist and top-down? And furthermore, how do we assess the connections between nationalist ideas and the political and social appropriation? We could move on into the conceptual terrain discussing how do we actually conceptualize romantic nationalism. But we could also, as Johnson has touched upon, dwell a little bit on history and geography and ask you, you put it very nicely when you say, how do we place a pin geographically? Should we place it in the middle of Europe, or should we move west and place it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? And furthermore, historically, where do we sort of place our focus? Is it in the 18th century or the 19th century? And these issues are always issues that are not only sort of being debated now, they are pertinent both to the work of the Association of Nations and Nationalism, the study of this
try and clarify at least, not the way it is, but the way I see it. If you look at Begriffsgeschichte, the conceptualization of the notion of patriotism, and you look at 18th century discourse using the word patriotism, it's remarkable how unnationalist it is. The notion of patriotism is usually used as in the sense of responsible citizenship, as a Ciceronian virtue. Love of the fatherland is like one of those virtues listed by Cicero as the virtues of the citizen, that almost goes together with marital fidelity and filial piety and other qualities that make us a better person. So Berkeley defines a patriot as one who heartily wishes the public prosperity and endeavours to promote it. That means just to be a responsible citizen. And love of the fatherland is really a sense that the fatherland is the society within which you live. So that in the Dutch patriotic revolution in the 1770s, or in French parlance during the French Revolution, patriote is an anti-aristocrat, because aristocrats are considered corrupt, venal, and to have the civic virtues of a classical republican like Cicero makes you a patriot. And also in the American Revolution, that is the sense in which patriot is used. That's what I call enlightenment patriotism. And the idea of a nation defined by its ethnic descent and by its culture only comes into it to a very small and subsidiary degree. And so I would heuristically, in my own way of using the words, distinguish enlightenment patriotism from romantic nationalism. And I see romantic nationalism as an overlay on that earlier basis, where in addition to the solidarity felt between citizens sharing a society, an economy, and a political system, there is added the ethnic community of the language and the other cultural factors which we have inherited from our ancestors, transgenerational. So I see transgenerational continuity. So I would see nationalism as an ethnic intensification of patriotism. That's only my own way of using the concept.
Yeah, well, as you know, since I reviewed your book, I thought very highly of it. But I thought there was a tension in the book between, again, your historicist account, your very careful way in which you showed how nationalist discourse was crystallized through superimposition of forms of discourse upon each other, which emphasized the very contingent nature of Nations and Nationalism. But there was this as others said, this negative teleology that nationalism begins as, well, associated with revolution and liberalism, becomes more reactionary, and then over time it becomes increasingly discredited. And I just wonder how you can reconcile these things, because the notion of superimposition suggests there are multiple elements alive in nationalism, even competing ideas of nationalism at any one point. And how you justify a kind of arc in this way. An arc that really doesn't, seems to work for Western Europe. But if you think of the Soviet collapse, where you get the revival of nationalism in a big way, again associated with the, as it were, return to modernity, then again that perhaps suggests the notion, perhaps you need a more sociological account that tries to explain why under certain circumstances certain strands of nationalism are taken up and not others. Because one of the important strands, of course, that is in nationalism for much of the 19th century and even into the 20th century is, of course, religion, which is, I think you were saying, it's religion that impassions many of the movements in Poland, Ireland, and so forth. Whereas you're very much emphasizing the kind of secular linguistic interpretation of nationalism.
Thank you. That's a very true point, and it's a real problem. Maybe the notion of the teleology, I tried to address it a little bit when I responded to Oliver, and I do still believe that historically you can maintain that the problematic contradictions within nationalism were more apparent around 1900 than they were around 1815. And at the same time, it is indeed true that what we have is an accumulation of, a discursive spice rack. You have all these flavors and different possibilities, and they're all there in your kitchen. And whatever dish you're cooking, you can take the flavor that you want. And there is a left-wing flavor, and there's a right-wing flavor, there's an exclusivist flavor, and there's an inclusivist flavor, and they're all there. And in here I would follow Karl Popper's notion of the world three. I think it's a very useful notion that between the world of kickable things and the world of absolute ideational abstractions, there is the embodied discourse that is there for reference, the books that are standing on the shelf waiting to be read. And indeed, I think it's extremely important as a social historical question and as a sociological question to see which flavors are taken out of the spice rack, at which moment, for which reasons. I think you absolutely have a point there, and I would not for one moment want to be seen to sort of disempower that extremely important historical approach. Why do people choose certain flavors in certain circumstances? At the same time, the fact that certain models are rendered thinkable, whereas others are not. The fact, for instance, that the notion of a Dalmatian ethnicity just disappeared in the 19th century, whereas it was quite strong until the end of Phoenician rule. A Slavic nation based on the Adriatic coast emancipating itself. Why should it be Croatian? Suddenly it becomes impossible to think of it as anything separately Dalmatian. So we see failed nationalisms in the course of the 19th century as well, things that drop out of the spice rack. I think if you only look at what people do with the available stuff, you lose sight from the stuff that is under the radar screen as what is relegated to the lumber room of history. And also it would be interesting to look at the latency periods, how certain models go under and suddenly are reactivated, and what happens while the books are unread. You need to do a literary history in order to trace them, because nobody's doing anything with them at the time. So yes, I see the point that we, at some point, and there is a, if you like, a persistent tradition of left-wing nationalism. We see it in Catalonia and in Scotland and in certain other parts where there is a persistence of a nationalism that allies itself with trade unionism, etc. And I would not want to deny that. At the same time, I meant pedagogically to explain it almost the other way around. If you write in Holland after the Second World War, you begin with the default that nationalism is a problem. And then you want to explain to readers that maybe it wasn't so much of a problem in the 1820s. So for us, we face the good nationalism or bad nationalism from a totally different starting point. It's not that I want to say it went bad. I want to say maybe at some points, in some circumstances, it wasn't bad. Surprise, surprise. And then that's how the book is written.
Right, we have two remaining questions, and then we'll close it. Anthony, Anthony?
Yes, well, there are many things, but your model is of a romantic overlay of ethnic nationalism over an enlightened patriotism. The question is, wherein lies the attraction of a romantic ethnic nationalism, unless you appeal, of course, to the ethnotypes, which then have to be given a causal force. They're not just lying around ready to be taken up, but they have an active force themselves. If it's not that, what is it that attracts so many people to this kind of romantic ethnic nationalism, as opposed to the earlier enlightened patriotism? Though I have to add that that enlightened patriotism had an element of ethnicity in it for some time. I mean, for example, in England, even going back to the Elizabethans and so on. So that's really my major question. Wherein lies this attraction, which then has such terrible consequences later on? Because I think behind what you're saying, there is, if not teleology, it generates the possibility of opening out to a genocidal racism in the end.
Thank you very much. Again, it would be fatuous to sort of pontificate on how the past was. I can only explain how it strikes me and what impression I took from the sources that I and it strikes me that very often the attractive force is less important than the repulsive force. In ethnotypes, antagonism comes before solidarity almost. And if you look at the writings of that crucial cohort of people who were writing, say, between 1800 and 1825, the later part of the Zappelzeit, I think in many cases there's a mixture of an attractor and an antagonistic force. And like the Enlightenment becomes a new form of tyranny and of totalitarianism, certainly in the Napoleonic form. People feel, for instance, that the abolition of long-standing institutions under the pressure of the strongly modernizing ideology that was the French Revolution, the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, the sort of thing that Burke complains about in the French Revolution, is also what Savigny complains about, the idea that a law system, which Savigny suddenly begins to see as the long expression of the moral track record of the nation, is being replaced by an ad hoc contrivance, thought up by some sort of diminutive Corsican warlord. And Savigny says every nation has its own law system, why should we follow the French one? And so the retreat into nativism is a resistance against foreign hegemony. And certainly a foreign hegemony that presents itself as the way to the future. And so the way back into the past is also a denial of a future made in France which ought to fit all of Europe. So there seems to be a sort of an antagonistic dialectics going on. Ironically, that same modernization process which provokes so many people into resistance at that time also makes it possible, it gives people the materials for their resistance, because as a result of a new state model in France, which had been prefigured by absolute Enlightenment monarchies in Prussia and the Josephine reforms elsewhere, etc. Medieval libraries are abolished everywhere, and all these holdings are brought into state archives. And suddenly people begin to read medieval manuscripts that have been lost for centuries, and they read for the first time in centuries the Nibelungenlied and Beowulf and the Chanson de Roland. And what happens in the Renaissance, vis-à-vis classical antiquity, where people rediscover classical antiquity, happens inside out around 1800. People rediscover the Middle Ages, because thanks to the modernizing process, suddenly these materials become available. And I've dealt with that at length in other publications. And so there's a big shock of the new there, and these two combine to place new value on the notion of authenticity. The Spanish are praised everywhere for resisting Napoleon and for having maintained their medieval romanceros and epics alive. The Germans imitate the Spanish, the Hungarians imitate the Germans, and everybody wants to resist a modernization which they feel is sweeping their historical heritage aside. This is how I would see the sources.
So for a final question and a quick final answer.
This is another greedy question, because it's not really about your book, but how we can somehow expand from what you've been arguing. It's about this kind of it's a European experience, exceptional, etc. Yeah. The starting point is, of course, this idea of being the dichotomy between civilized and barbarians. It's not European, it's everywhere. Yeah. Maybe not omnipresent, but it's everywhere. For instance, in China, they have very, very clear idea who the civilized one is and who are not civilized ones, like us. We are not civilized. And they have certain mechanisms you mentioned, like writing histories, keeping official histories, etc., etc., collecting material. That was all there. Nevertheless, they didn't come up with type of nationalism you have been described in the book. Perhaps one of the reasons, your answer, I would think, to this question is that because they didn't have a romanticism or some sort. And following that, when you look at Japanese history, there's something very obscure happened sometime in the late 18th century. there's a group of scholars called, it's always translated native school. Those people who started looking at consciously, for the first time consciously, looking at original text of Japanese history, literature, etc., and started looking for what is original or true Japaneseness is, etc. This happened under Tokugawa shogunate, which has a policy not to be in contact with Europe or elsewhere. So it's kind of spontaneous. I don't think it is kind of a response to the romanticism in Europe, but it has somehow come about, and it was taken up by a certain fraction which was behind the imperial court at the end of the Tokugawa period, who were really keen on expelling foreigners. Still, at the end of the day, after Meiji restoration, what happened was that these people lost power, and those people who wanted to open up and try to catch up as quickly as possible with power, etc. So it's kind of
answer that question.
Well, I can be very brief because I don't know enough about the cases that you bring on to speak with any authority at all. I do not presume that the European model has explanatory value for nationalism elsewhere in the world. However, I would say that from the mid to late 19th century onwards, of course, there are very important forms of communication between European intellectuals and intellectuals, especially in Asia. One person that Eleanor and I know is Tsubochi Shoyo, and we get the notion that the idea of the academic intellectual as somebody who can mediate between an erudite knowledge of the nation's history and the challenges facing the country nowadays is maybe a European role model, which gets alongside with the Western model of the university as part of the modernization process of countries all over the world, and that certain modalities of the intellectual in present-day society and also the type of learning and historicist learning that such intellectuals might become instrumentalized in the same way. I know that certainly in Southern Asia and India this is the case after the Bengal Renaissance. It's not to say that all of the world begins to follow the European pattern, because they don't. They follow patterns of their own, but there are communicative cross-currents between those parts of the world.
Thank you very much. It seems to me there's a lot of work to be done, both on academic and artistic intellectuals and choral societies in relation to national movements. Thank you very much to our speakers.